Time. That merciless judge. That relentless critic. That voice in your head whispering, "You're too late." But what if I told you that history's greatest revolutionaries, artists, and game changers didn't just ignore that voice? They laughed at it. What if the most powerful force in human civilization wasn't youth, but persistence? Tonight, we journey through 2,500 years of magnificent late bloomers. From ancient China to modern America. From desert scholars to kitchen table inventors. These aren't just success stories. They're acts of rebellion against time itself. So buckle up, because we're about to discover that the best things in life don't come to those who wait. They come to those who wait, and then strike like lightning. When empires were young and wisdom was ancient. The philosopher who started over. Confucius, 551 to 479 BCE, started teaching at 50. Ancient China, 500 years before Christ. A middle-aged government clerk named Kong Chiu, you know him as Confucius, just got fired. Again. At 50, he was what we'd call today unemployable. Too idealistic for politics. Too practical for poetry. His colleagues whispered he was past his prime. But here's what they didn't know. This washed-up bureaucrat was about to create a philosophy that would shape the minds of billions for over 2 millennia. Him wandering from village to village, a philosophical hobo with a handful of faithful students. The dust on his robes, the skeptical looks from younger scholars, the constant rejection by rulers who preferred their advisors young and malleable. But Confucius had something youth couldn't offer. The bitter wisdom of failure. The deep understanding that comes only from watching empires crumble and friends betray. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of lived experience. It does not matter how slowly you go as long as you do not stop. He said that at 60, when most people were planning their burial arrangements, Confucius was just hitting his intellectual stride. The poet who found his voice in exile. Libai, 701 to 762 CE. Peak career after 40. Flash forward to Tang Dynasty China. Meet Li Bai, the immortal poet, who spent his youth as a wandering drunk, failed businessman, and court reject. At 42, when most poets had already written their masterpieces, Li Bai was still stumbling through life like a beautiful disaster. He'd been kicked out of the imperial court for being too honest, too drunk, or too brilliant, depending on who you asked. But then something magical happened. All that wandering, all that drinking, all that heartbreak crystallized into the most exquisite poetry China had ever seen. Listen to this, he wrote at 45. The moon is bright above. I wonder if it's frost upon the ground. Looking up, I see the moon so bright. Bowing my head, I think of home tonight. Simple? Yes. Profound? Absolutely. But here's the kicker, he could only write that because he'd spent. The scholar who bridged worlds. Ibn Rushd, Averroes, 1126 to 1198. Major works after 50. Córdoba, Spain, 1180. The Islamic Golden Age is blazing, but our hero Ibn Rushd, known to the West as Averroes, is having a midlife crisis of epic proportions. At 54, he's just a provincial judge watching younger scholars get all the attention. His radical commentaries on Aristotle? Ignored. His philosophical innovations? Dismissed. But then the Christians and Muslims start really fighting. Books are burning. Scholars are fleeing. And suddenly, everyone realizes they need someone who understands both worlds. Ibn Rushd becomes the bridge. His translations and commentaries don't just preserve Greek philosophy, they revolutionize it. When his works reach medieval Europe, they spark the Renaissance itself. Thomas Aquinas, centuries later, called him simply the commentator, not because he was young and brilliant, but because he was old and wise enough to see connections others missed. He died at 72, just as his ideas were setting Europe on fire. Talk about perfect timing. Jalal ad-Din Rumi, 1207 to 1273. Mystical Poetry After 37. Konya, Turkey, 1244. Rumi is 37, a respected but unremarkable Islamic scholar. Solid, boring, the kind of guy who gives perfectly adequate Friday sermons that put people to sleep. Then he meets Shams Tabrizi. This wild, wandering mystic turns Rumi's world upside down. They become soul friends, studying, debating, disappearing for days in spiritual ecstasy. The other scholars get jealous. They murder Shams, and in that moment of devastating loss, the boring scholar dies, and the greatest mystical poet in history is born. For the next 30 years, Rumi pours out 40,000 verses of the most ecstatic spiritual poetry ever written. He's 40, 50, 60, dancing, whirling, spinning words into gold. Out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right-doing, there is a field. I'll meet you there. He wrote that at 55. 55. When he should have been settling down, he was just learning to fly. You know what's fascinating? We've traveled through 1,500 years of history, and the pattern is always the same. Youth gives you energy, but age gives you perspective. Youth lets you climb mountains, but age teaches you which mountains are worth climbing. Take a moment, stretch, think about your own mountains. We're just getting started. The artist who peaked after everyone said he was done. Hokusai, 1760 to 1849. The Great Wave, at 70. Jump to 1830s Japan. Hokusai is 70 years old, and by all accounts, he should be done. He's already famous, already successful, already past his prime. But here's what makes Hokusai legendary. At 70, he looks at his life's work and says, essentially, men, I'm just getting started. That's when he creates the Great Wave off Kanagawa, the most recognizable image in all of Asian art. The 70, when most artists are painting safe, comfortable pictures of flowers, Hokusai is reimagining the very relationship between man and nature. But wait, it gets better. At 73, he writes, all I have done before the age of 70 is not worth bothering with. At 75, I'll have learned something of the pattern of nature, of animals, of plants, of trees, birds, fish, and insects. At 100, I may have a real understanding of their character. He died at 89, still improving, still hungry, still learning. His last words? If heaven will give me just another 10 years. The writer who found her voice in revolution. George Sand, 1804 to 1876. Literary career at 27, peak at 40 plus. Paris, 1830s. Amantine Dupin, who we know as George Sand, just left her husband, put on men's clothes, and decided to become a writer. She's 27, broke, and completely scandalous. But here's the secret. Her early novels were good, but her later ones were magnificent. It took years of living, loving Chopin, raising children, surviving political upheaval, to give her the emotional depth that made her immortal. At 40, she writes Consuelo. At 45, she's mentoring young writers while writing her masterpieces. At 50, she's still falling in love, still causing scandals, still revolutionizing what it meant to be a woman artist. The young George Sand shocked people. The mature George Sand changed the world. When steam engines met steam dreams. The inventor who lit up the world. Thomas Edison, 1847 to 1931. Light bulb at 32. Peak inventions 40s 50s. Hold on, Edison? A late bloomer? The guy who invented the light bulb at 32? Here's what they don't teach you in school. Edison's early inventions were clever, but his world-changing innovations came when he was older, wiser, and had failed enough to understand what people actually needed. The phonograph at 30? Nice party trick. The light bulb at 32? Revolutionary. But the electrical grid that actually made the light bulb useful? He was in his 40s. The motion picture camera? 43 and counting. The man didn't hit his stride until middle age, when he had the business sense to match his technical genius. Youth gave him creativity, but age gave him strategy. At 50, while younger inventors were still playing with gadgets, Edison was rebuilding civilization itself. The photographer who captured America's soul. Matthew Brady, 1822 to 1896, Civil War photography at 40, 1861. The American Civil War begins, and Matthew Brady, at 39, makes a decision that will bankrupt him but immortalize him. He's going to photograph war. Not the glory, the reality. Brady spends his life savings, risks his life, and revolutionizes how humanity sees conflict. Before Brady, war was romantic. After Brady, war was real. But here's the heartbreaking part. He's too old to be a soldier, too young to be wise enough to protect his business. His photographs change history, but they destroy him financially. Sometimes being a late bloomer means you're old enough to see what matters, but still young enough to sacrifice everything for it. Now we return to our familiar friends, but with deeper understanding. Anna Grandma Moses, the farm woman who painted America's memory. September 7, 1940. Anna Moses, 78 years old, arthritic hands barely able to hold a brush, is about to have her first art exhibition. A woman who spent 60 years milking cows and canning peaches suddenly becomes the most celebrated American artist of her generation. But here's what makes her story incredible. She didn't start painting despite her age. She started painting because of it. See, young artists paint what they imagine. Old artists paint what they remember. And Anna Moses remembered an America that was disappearing. Barn raisings, sleigh rides, communities that actually knew each other's names. When critics said her technique was primitive, she'd smile and say, "I paint what I see." When they said her subjects were too simple, she'd reply, "Simple is what lasts." She painted until she was 101. 101. Her last painting was called Rainbow, because even at the end, she was still seeing beauty that others missed. Colonel Sanders, the king of second chances. September 24, 1952. Harlan Sanders, 62, is sitting in his car outside his 1009th restaurant rejection. He's tired, broke, and frankly, too old for this nonsense. But he walks into restaurant number 1010. "Sir, would you like to try my chicken recipe?" And the manager says, "Yes." That's all it took. One yes after 1,000 numbers. But here's the beautiful part. If he'd gotten that yes at 25, he wouldn't have been ready for it. At 62, he had the patience to perfect the recipe, the wisdom to understand business, and the desperation to never give up. Kentucky Fried Chicken became a global empire because a senior citizen refused to act senior. February 6, 1939. Raymond Chandler, 51, fired from his oil company job, sits at his kitchen table with a typewriter and a dream. He'd spent decades pushing pencils and pushing whiskey. Now he was going to push boundaries. It was about 11 o'clock in the morning, mid-October, with the sun not shining and a look of hard wet rain in the clearness of the foothills. First line of The Big Sleep. written by a man who'd lived enough hard, wet mornings to know exactly how they felt. Chandler didn't just create detective fiction, he elevated it to literature. But he could only do that because he'd worked in the real world long enough to understand how corruption actually operates, how loneliness actually feels, how hope actually dies and gets reborn. Philip Marlowe wasn't born from imagination. He was born from experience. The global revolution continues. Haruki Murakami, the jazz-loving novelist. Tokyo, 1978. Haruki Murakami, 29, owns a jazz bar. He's happy, comfortable, completely unknown. Then he goes to a baseball game, and while watching a perfectly hit double, he has an epiphany. I think I can write a novel. He goes home and starts writing. 30. In a culture that worships young prodigies, he's practically geriatric. But Murakami's late start gave him something precious. A fully formed voice. His novels read like jazz sounds. Meandering, surprising, deeply soulful. He didn't have to find his style because he'd already lived it. Norwegian Wood, The Wind-Up Bird Chronicle, Kafka on the Shore. All written by a man who understood that the best stories come from marinating in life for a while. Vera Wang, The Fashion Revolutionary. 1990. Vera Wang, 40, just got passed over for the editor-in-chief position at Vogue. She's devastated, angry, and about to change wedding fashion forever. See, young designers create for young bodies. But Wang, at 40, understood that women of all ages deserved to feel beautiful. Her wedding dresses weren't just pretty. They were architectural marvels that made every bride feel like a goddess. She didn't start her fashion house until 40, but by 50 she was dressing celebrities. By 60 she was a global brand. By 70 she was still designing, still innovating, still proving that style has no expiration date. Julia Child, the cook who changed how America eats. 1961. Julia Child, 49, publishes Mastering the Art of French Cooking. She's never been to culinary school, never worked in a restaurant, never even cooked seriously until her 30s. But that's exactly why she succeeded. Professional chefs write for other chefs. Julia wrote for regular people who wanted to make something beautiful for the people they loved. At 50, she's teaching America that cooking isn't about perfection. It's about passion. At 60, she's on television showing millions that it's okay to make mistakes. At 80, she's still teaching us that the best meals come from the heart, not the recipe. Never apologize for your cooking, she said at 85, because by then, she knew that confidence was the secret ingredient all along. So here we are. We've traveled through 2,500 years of human history, from ancient Chinese philosophers to modern American dreamers. From medieval mystics to contemporary creators. And what have we learned? That Confucius didn't find his voice until 50. That Rumi didn't discover God until 37. That Hokusai didn't paint his masterpiece until 70. That Colonel Sanders didn't build his empire until 62. That Julia Child didn't change American cuisine until 49. But more than that, we've learned that late blooming isn't a consolation prize. It's not settling for second best. It's not making do with what's left. Late blooming is the ultimate rebellion against a culture that worships youth and dismisses experience. It's the magnificent defiance of people who refuse to accept that their best days are behind them. You see, the dirty little secret about success is this. The world is full of promising young people who peaked at 25. But it's the late bloomers, the ones who kept learning, kept growing, kept failing and getting back up, who change the world. Because youth gives you energy, but age gives you wisdom. Youth gives you dreams, but age gives you the tools to build them. Youth gives you passion, but age gives you patience. And patience, my friends, is the most revolutionary force in human history. So if you're sitting there thinking your ship has sailed, let me tell you something. Your ship hasn't even been built yet. The lumber is still growing in the forest. The wind that will fill your sails is still being born in distant storms. The harbor where you'll finally dock victory is still being dredged by tomorrow's dreamers. It's not about when you bloom. It's about how magnificent you are when you finally do. And trust me, when you finally bloom, the whole garden stops to stare. After all, the most beautiful flowers are always worth the wait.